For tens of thousands of years, the Neanderthals roamed Europe's bleak grasslands, braving cave bears, mammoths, and the freezing winters of the Ice Age. And then they vanished. Their disappearance has stirred a debate and speculation for over a century. Still, the mystery lingers. I'm John Rhys Davis. Join me as we explore the prehistoric world of Neanderthal. Next on Archeology. Imagine it is 100,000 years ago. An ice sheet 1 mile thick grinds over Scandinavia and Siberia. Most of Europe is an endless expanse of prairie with howling winds and stunted vegetation. In the sheltered valleys, the Neanderthals huddle under cliffs and in cave mouths, hunting some animals familiar today, while facing others now extinct. The fearsome cave bear, cave lion, giant bison, and woolly mammoth. For untold generations, the Neanderthals had Europe to themselves. Then a new, modern type of human began developing and spreading slowly from Africa. For centuries, Neanderthals and moderns coexisted, apparently in peace. Then, the Neanderthals vanished.
Why did Neanderthals as a group die out, and why did modern humans become the only form of humans that are around? We don't have all the answers to that question. It's a very difficult question to answer, but it's one where we're starting to get a series of leads from research into the fossils and research into the archaeology, the debris that they left behind.
Our fascination with this beetle-browed fellow has not dimmed in the 150 years since we first made his acquaintance. Artists have given him his human face. Physical anthropologists are trying to make him walk and talk again. And the enduring question of his relationship to us remains. Did Neanderthal and modern man coexist in peace or conflict? Did they go their separate ways? Could they have interbred? Only one thing seems clear from the archaeological record. The life of a Neanderthal was not an easy one. In 1856, a human skeleton was found in a cave in the Neander Valley in Germany. Its discovery began a century-and-a-half argument over the Neanderthals. At the turn of the century, archaeologists and collectors ransacked the cliff sites of southwest France, hunting for Neanderthal bones. The first attempt at a scientific study of this find from La Chapelle was a disaster and misled a whole generation. This 50-year-old Neanderthal's bones were deformed by arthritis, but they led a French scientist to declare that all Neanderthals were stooping hunchbacks with bow legs who couldn't walk straight. The image of the brutish caveman was born. How could such a pathetic creature have possibly survived the rigors of the Ice Age? In reality, scientists have begun a more realistic effort to flesh out the fossil bones. They're using the latest forensic techniques to bring us a true portrait of the Neanderthals, the same techniques police use to identify missing people. Medical artist Michael Anderson first needs his own copy of the La Chapelle skull. To do that, he's made a mold of the skull.
This is a 3-piece mold. The eye sockets out. And there's the cast. It's an exact copy of the original.
And that's our final cast. The Neanderthal skull is similar to modern human skulls, and the measurements of the Neanderthal skull fit within the range of modern human populations. But there are some unique qualities to Neanderthal skulls, some of which are, it has a low forehead and high brow ridges here. It also has a large nasal opening. This is characteristic of Neanderthals, and this recessed chin. They don't have a pointed chin like a lot of skulls do in modern human populations.
With the aid of a modern anatomy text, Anderson carefully applies clay to reproduce the exact shape of the muscles that were once attached to the Neanderthal skull.
The muscles on a Neanderthal skull are exactly the same as what you find in a modern human skull. Pathologists have determined that this individual was about in his 40s, which is quite old for a Neanderthal, and he had 2 teeth left in the skull. And this led researchers to believe that he couldn't take care of himself anymore, and it just also points out that life was quite hard for the Neanderthals, and hence I tried to put in some of the gray in the beard, the salt and pepper look, but most likely this person would have had scars on his face and would have been beat up quite a bit, and this is a fairly pristine view of it, but I think that this portrait would have been recognized by members of the tribe, though, in the Neanderthal tribe.
And here is the entire Neanderthal, reconstructed by Anderson with the same meticulous forensic techniques. The ancient bones no longer give us an image of depravity and brutishness, but a startlingly familiar one of vigor and muscularity.
First of all, one of the first things that you notice when you look at a Neanderthal, whether a reconstruction of a Neanderthal or just look at their bones, is they were extremely massively built. For example, the attachments for their pectoral muscles, what bodybuilders call pecs, were about twice the size of those of modern humans. They had the physique of a Mr. Universe without having to work at it. They all had it. It was part of their everyday existence. They did it for survival, not to win world contests. One of the problems with being so strongly built is, again, it's energetically very costly. It's like an athlete in training. You have to take in a lot of calories, and which puts the Neanderthals in a vicious circle. They have to take in a lot of calories to maintain these powerful bodies. In order to take in those calories, they have to be very active and go out and get lots of food, and it's a vicious cycle that builds on itself.
Why were the Neanderthals built like Mr. Universe? There's a clue in the stone tools they made.
These are complex tools that require a lot of dexterity to make. Neanderthals made these, but what they resulted in were either handheld tools, like holding a knife by the blade rather than with an effective handle, or spears that were thrusting spears that were not very effective at throwing. They didn't have anything like a bow and arrow, so they would have had to get into close quarters, probably through an ambush, to bring down prey the size of a deer, which they did do.
So their limited tools put a premium on strength and fitness, sculpting the mighty muscles which left their marks on the bones. But these same bones also tell a grimmer story of constant threats to the Neanderthals as they struggled for existence. Next, in the search for the Neanderthals. The bones of the Neanderthals tell a harrowing tale of the risks they faced in the perilous prehistoric world of the Ice Age.
They have broken bones on their faces. They have broken arm bones, foot bones, hand bones. They have breaks, bruises, bad sprains, pretty much everywhere, as long as they were able to keep moving. And what is very interesting is that the distribution of breaks in their bodies is very similar to the distribution of fractures that you find in rodeo riders, especially bull riders and the like. And what this suggests is a lot of close encounters of a nasty animal kind. The trauma, the growth defects, the low life expectancy, all of it suggests to us that Neanderthals were having a tough time, and that any modern human population that moved into the area, that for whatever reason, whatever organizational or technological reason, was able to increase their life expectancy, to increase their survivalship of infants, of children, of adolescents. Any even very subtle increase in that, in those demographic aspects of their populations would lead over a few thousand years to a complete replacement of Neanderthal populations.
But it wasn't just physical risks that put Neanderthals at a disadvantage. Lewis Binford, who's studied Neanderthals for nearly 30 years, thinks more subtle aspects of behavior made them less able to cope with change than modern humans. One difference seems to have been their inefficient use of fire.
Modern man has, let's say, relatively poor fuels in a fuel-scarce environment. He'll bring in stones, he'll start a fire. As combustion goes on, the stones heat up that he puts in the fire. Then after the fuel is burned down, he's still got radiant heat. He can move those warm stones into a sleeping area or whatever, and they appear in the archaeological site as fire-cracked rock. There isn't any such material in Neanderthal sites, yet they were living in severe environments in which this would have been a very useful tactic to have had. They didn't do it.
But if Binford is right, there was a more fundamental problem. A failure to plan ahead, to take advantage of predictable seasonal events, like an annual salmon run.
It's very hard in Neanderthal sites to find many salmon bones in environments where you pretty well know there were salmon, because the salmon bones are in the feces of bears that were contemporary. So they basically seem to be exploiting the environment on an encounter basis rather than on a planned schedule or a tactical basis, which is really what we do quite well.
So did Neanderthals die out because they were unintelligent? The skulls tell us that Neanderthals had brains as big as ours, sometimes even bigger. The question is, how were they using them?
I think Neanderthals were smart, just that the way in which their intelligence was organized and in terms of what it made possible was perhaps a bit different. That their behavior was exactly like us, or just sort of a watered-down version, or a kind of group of people who needed a Head Start program to make them like us. I think that's perhaps romance, because it doesn't address the issue, what were they really like? And that's what we'd like to know, and a lot of people are trying to find out.
What were the Neanderthals really like? In the continuing quest for their identity, new clues have surfaced about the unusual relationships between Neanderthal men and women. For 100,000 years, Neanderthals endured their brief, hard lives. Then modern man emerged, first in Africa and gradually spread throughout the Near East and Europe until about 35,000 years ago, there were no more Neanderthals left.
There seems to have been a lot of intermixing in areas like Central Europe, probably less in Western Europe, but the whole thing seems to have been peaceful. And even in Western Europe, where the Neanderthals seem to have died out largely without issue, they probably were simply outcompeted for resources.
The question is, were they just a side branch, a dead end with no relation to us? Or does every one of us walk around with traces of this strange type of human in our genes?
Well, the issue of how much genetic material we may have shared with the Neanderthals is perhaps put in perspective better by some of the biological chemists who point out that we share about 95% of the genetic material with chimpanzees. So we certainly share an awful lot, even if there was no crossbreeding with the Neanderthals.
If we shared so much, Why did the Neanderthals and their way of life die out? Lewis Binford thinks peculiarities of Neanderthal behavior doomed them to die out. And nothing was more peculiar than the relationship between Neanderthal men and women.
Were they organized like us into basic families in which males and females cooperated in support of the young and help feed one another and stuff? Of course, this is something we'd like very much to know.
From the Neanderthal site of Combe-Grenal in southwest France, Binford draws an extraordinary conclusion. Men and women, he thinks, led largely separate lives, foraging outside the cave and eating most of what they encountered on the spot. There was little bringing back of food to share. That vital human institution, the family, seems to be missing.
I think we have to imagine that much consumption is done individualistically and where it's encountered. And those things that are brought back to the cave are primarily things that require processing, breaking open, heating, or something like that. So that we're not seeing a normal picture of a family coming home for supper. This is also borne out by the kinds of species that we find in different places in the cave. And the frequency with which we think we have some ability to recognize what is male and female, which is arguable, but there's certainly kind of dichotomy in the site, suggesting that females may well be on their own much of the time, and males come in periodically, but they're not permanently associated as a mixed-sex group.
Was cooperation between men and women a key advantage that modern humans had over the Neanderthals? An advantage that pushed inefficient Neanderthals into oblivion? Many disagree with Binford and point to evidence suggesting a concern for family. In fact, a Neanderthal mind hauntingly like our own.
The Neanderthals were the first humans to intentionally bury their dead. We have about 24 burials of Neanderthals, from little children to old adults, men, women, boys, girls. Burying a family member who dies, whether it's a child or an adult, says that you care about that person, that that person has a specific social role in the group, that that person is important, and for the memory of that person, and to, in a sense, readjust the roles, the social roles of the people within that group, you go through some kind of a ritual, what we call a funeral.
The argument that they cared for wounded persons or aged individuals, and that proves that they had a kind of emotional or more spiritual orientation to the world. I'm not so sure that that's totally convincing. Many other animals tolerate or even care for or help support disadvantaged animals on occasion. Other primates do this. There's a beautiful example from the macaques in Japan of a congenitally disadvantaged individual that made it and reproduced children and so forth. So that kind of evidence is not that convincing.
They moved, they walked, they handled objects, they spoke language just as capably as any of us do. They may have had a slightly different accent than we do because they had larger mouths with larger faces, but basically, if you tried to teach them Chinese or English or French or Swahili or whatever, you wouldn't have any trouble doing it. They were perfectly capable of speaking modern human languages.
But Lewis Binford thinks that it was modern humans who had the first effective language.
This is not to be confused with communication. I'm sure the early guys had good communication systems, nor necessarily speech or the ability to articulate sound. That could be a communication system. The issue is how it's organized.
So what really happened when Neanderthals, perhaps disadvantaged in speech, technology, and food gathering, encountered fully modern humans?
Of course, it's interesting to speculate, particularly based on the Western European data, where we have some suggestion that Neanderthals were probably around at the time that also fully modern man was around.
They gradually spread, they intermixed with the Neanderthals, they produced offspring with them who would have ancestors both of Neanderthal and modern human biology or anatomy, and that the resultant populations would then spread further west and further north, eventually establishing what we call early modern humans and leading to the eventual disappearance by 35,000 years ago of what we call Neanderthals.
How ironic that the ancient people once depicted as subhuman brutes must have made a contribution to the genes of all of us living today.
There are no Neanderthals alive today, but the Neanderthals did not die out without issue. They passed on their genes, they passed on offspring that themselves became the ancestors of modern Europeans.
So we have given Neanderthal a human face, and in many ways it looks startlingly like our own. They cared for their sick and their injured in a world fraught with disease and danger. They gently buried and mourned their dead, and they probably looked forward to a better life in the next world. But they could not see beyond their day-to-day, hand-to-mouth existence. In the end, this lack of foresight may have killed them off. Perhaps we, their successors, would do well to remember that.